speakers. Director of the National Council of Canadian Tamils. We're just waiting for him to arrive. There's Paul Sang, who was president of the Steelworkers Club in 1998. Refugee is organizing the War Resisters Support Campaign and a member of the International Socialists. My name is Jesse McLaren, and we're chairing the session. And also, I just want to briefly also speak just my own personal thoughts as a physician who's been involved in some of the protests against the really brutal events to refugee healthcare. So we actually talked about this at last year's conference. April 25th of the preceding year, without any sort of consultation or any prior notice to any refugee health organizations, without consulting any health providers, organizations, Immigration Minister Jason Kenney announced a drastic series of cuts that would be implemented 5 weeks later on June 30th to the interim federal health program. Now, according to the Canadian Council for Refugees, the government's own figures show that the per capita cost for refugee claimants under the IFHP is only about 10% of the average per capita cost for Canadians. So the interim federal health program is a very modest program, but it provides very basic and essential health services. So why would a government go after such a relatively small but very critical program? So Minister Kenney provided 3 reasons. He said the cuts were necessary because they were fair, they would save money, and they would protect public health. And of course, none of this is true. First, by denying the most basic medically necessary care to people who have fled rape, torture, murder, mass expulsions is not fair, it's clearly inhumane. Second, by cutting primary care, this actually costs money. By denying preventive medicine necessary to prevent hospital admissions and to prevent complications, that actually drives people with untreated medical issues that develop complications into emergency departments, into lengthy hospital admissions, again, which is, first of all, cruel, but also costly. But of course, what the government was doing was downloading the costs onto the provinces. So this had nothing to do whatsoever with saving money and everything about downloading costs. Third, these cuts threaten public health in 2 ways. Firstly, by denying lab tests and treatment for basic conditions like tuberculosis. This is clearly a public health threat. If you only treat people once they've presented to the emergency department, coughing up blood with a fever, rather than having a simple x-ray in an outpatient clinic. And secondly, this is part of a much broader attack on healthcare. It's no secret that the Conservative government wants to privatize the healthcare system. But of course, Medicare is extremely popular. It's always the #1 issue that Canadians care about because there's been a long, proud history of struggle to actually get this. And so what they've done is they've started with the most marginalized, most vulnerable population whose healthcare they're going after and who they are then scapegoating, saying that refugee health itself is depriving everyone else of healthcare rather than seeing the government's cuts as denying everyone from healthcare. And I think what they assumed, because refugees are so demonized in society, that it would be a pretty easy thing to get rid of. And there wouldn't really be much uproar. But funny thing happened. On May 11th of last year, 90 physicians occupied the office of Joe Oliver, who's a Tory cabinet minister in Toronto. This was coordinated with actions in Winnipeg and a press conference in Ottawa. And together these actions launched the Canadian Doctors for Refugee Care. On May 11th, an open letter condemning these cuts was signed by every major health organization across the country. On June 18th, there was a national day of action to stop the cuts to refugee care, with actions in a dozen cities with doctors, nurses, midwives, and other providers. Now, because of this, on June 29th, on the eve of the cuts, the government actually reversed a small number of cuts. And then later on, they made a few other tweaks, and this really showed that this would only have happened with all these big mobilizations. At the same time, the vast majority of cuts did go through, and their pulling back on them just created a series of confusions. And since then, the Canadian Doctors for Refugee Care has released a number of reports documenting the cruelty of these cuts. And I just want to briefly list, these are documented cases. A man was denied eye surgery to prevent blindness. A man with symptoms of tuberculosis was denied an x-ray. A woman was denied asthma medication, resulting in costly ER visits and hospitalization. A child and refugee applicant was denied immunizations. A teenager with PTSD and suicide attempts was denied psychiatric medication. A young girl with fever was denied investigation for malaria. A woman survivor of sexual violence was denied treatment. A pregnant woman fleeing the sex trade was denied tests. Now, since then, the Canadian Austerity Refugee Care and the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers has launched a constitutional challenge against cuts, and this coming June 17th will be the second annual Pan-Canadian Day of Action against cuts to refugee health care, and there's confirmed action that will happen in a dozen cities across the country. So I just wanted to introduce this, just both to talk about the cruelty of these cuts, how they're part of a much broader agenda, but also that there's a lot of opposition to them and a lot of potential to really be able to build a big, broad movement. So I just want to introduce our first speaker, who we're very pleased to have, Paul Tsang, who's the president of Steelworkers Local 1998. As we've seen, the conservative drive have used racism to drive down wages, like the temporary foreign worker program. And when the RBC scandal broke out, in some ways it was presented as foreign workers against Canadian workers, whereas the labour movement has played a really important role trying to unionize migrant workers and fight for status for all. So Paul Tsang will tell us a little more about them, and please welcome.
Okay, I'm going to stand up. I'm going to crouch down. I'm going to stand up because my back's hurting. We're fighting capital 24/7 against it, but we vote around. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. I was at the Marxism conference about 11 years ago, and I guess I may have been a bit too provocative, or maybe incited some audience reaction, and I haven't been invited back since, so it's been about 11 years. So thank you for inviting me back. Maybe it's just that people forgot, maybe we shouldn't invite Paul for these things, but I'll try to keep my comments within line with the spirit of this. So that's right. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the HD mining scandal that people have been following probably since November of 2012, and it's still an ongoing issue. Just as a case study about labor's reaction to the temporary foreign workers program. This was, the HD mining is the issue in BC, where the mining company was bought by a Chinese company, a company in China, and they exercised their right to the temporary foreign worker program. That was the program that was established by the federal government. And the recent tweaks to that program, that was one of the three programs, temporary foreign workers program, the seasonal agricultural workers, the caregivers program, that's supposed to ostensibly address labor shortages, market shortages in labor. But we can see that the Harper government has perverted that to sort of twist it around into an anti-union, anti-worker, very much a divisive program where the temporary foreign worker program is set up to pit worker against worker, to sow dissent, and in this case, in HD mining, to sow racism as a divide and rule tactic to divide workers. So I'd just like to use that as a case study, maybe to talk about labor's response to that, to the wedge that's being driven into the workers. So just a quick overview of the HD mining. That's the first point. That was the plan to use temporary foreign workers from China. That's at the Tumbler Ridge coal mining. In the recent court challenge by the unions, by USW, it was determined that the Canadian miners would be hired only eventually within 4 years after the mining had started in that area. And the temporary foreign workers would be continued to be used for 10 years. That's by no means temporary. And it doesn't speak to the idea that coal mining has been happening at the Tumbler Ridge for decades. There's a whole generation of expertise in mining, coal mining at Tumbler Ridge. So the idea that the temporary foreign worker program is actually trying to address a labor shortage, I mean, that just speaks to the lie that would like to be perpetuated. The temporary foreign worker program, other examples of it, so the RBC, World Bank of Canada, that's also that it hit the newspapers, the idea that the outsourcing arrangements, that current workers would actually train temporary foreign workers. I mean, that's another idea. That's the temporary foreign worker program is really just an anti-worker program. It's a program to drive down wages, drive down benefits, increase precarious work. It has nothing to do with labor shortages. That the idea the workers themselves would actually be trained in the replacements in the temporary foreign worker program. It's definitely problematic. Certainly there are economic concerns. The federal government has set up this program and has allowed for the payment of 15% less in the market wages. So there's not just the economic concerns, certainly the savings is there, but these are politically motivated decisions. This is a politically motivated program, the temporary foreign workers program. And it's not just an economic program, but its social impact can't be denied in terms of pitting worker against worker, tearing apart communities, driving down wages, and jeopardizing health and safety, and also the threat against unions, that many of the workers that come on these programs aren't allowed to unionize, aren't allowed to have the basic fundamental rights of unions and the protections of unions. Media representation is important. This is just an example that was in the, this came out in the spring of 2012. It was to celebrate the 70th anniversary of steelworkers. That was the special edition of USW at Work, and that came out just last spring. And that was where the union was, or that's where the union was in terms of media representation of Chinese workers. So the article itself, it's a fairly strong article. It talks about government policies, talks about free trade, talks about various other progressive things, but the media representation of that, you can see Chinese endangered American auto parts, and there's a Chinese worker there. And I think it's very dangerous in terms of pitting worker against worker. The idea that workers should be concerned about their jobs or concerned about their, and certainly it hits very much at the heart of generally a fear, like a racial fear, an economic fear. It's very divisive. It's sort of a divide and rule. And it's unfortunate that USW had selected that. I think it was a stock photo, wasn't it? It was sort of a plan to sort of say, let's put down Chinese workers. But the idea that the unions have to be aware when they put out their publications, that this went out to every single USW member internationally. It was sent to their home addresses, and the representation of that, it was a fine article and whatnot, but the idea that you might actually sow dissent or worker dissent, that's problematic. So that was about a year ago, and I'll sort of show you where we are a year later. So here we are. In terms of the worker response, the locals have gotten together. There's a national policy conference in Vancouver, and they've gotten together and sort of took a step back and say the idea that when you're campaigning against the temporary foreign worker program, that the idea it's a government program. These political decisions are being made, and that it shouldn't really pit worker against worker. It should be the idea that union representation is important, the idea that health and safety is important, communities are important, jobs are important, and all those things are important. So focus on the issues rather than sort of the divide and rule that the Harper government would actually like to sow with these programs. So this is a year later. This is the Workers' Rights Campaign. So it's a focus on workers' rights. So it's solidarity with workers internationally. The idea that all workers deserve a living wage, all workers deserve health and safety, and all workers deserve the right to decent wages and working conditions. Here's some posters here. I don't know if you can see it in this light that says "Path to Citizenship for Temporary Workers." So the idea that if you're good enough to work, you're good enough to have citizenship in Canada. So that was passed as a policy for USW. So the idea that if there's a labor shortage, then Canada's built on immigration. It's with the exception of the First Nations, it's built on colonialism. It's built on racism. It's built on so on and so forth. But the idea that if you're good enough to work, you should be good enough to have citizenship and all the rights, unionization, EI and CPP and whatnot. Stop the abuse of temporary foreign workers. So the idea that all workers have rights, and that all unions, all workers should stand up for those rights. Permanent residents, not temporary workers. So the idea that if there is a labor shortage, that you deserve citizenship rights. And further on down, I didn't put that as training for youth and Aboriginal workers. I can't remember the last one. It was something important, but not important enough for me to actually show it to you today. But you get the idea. So the idea from a year a year ago to have a media representation of a Chinese worker to a year later where there's actually a media campaign, a membership education campaign. There's actually policies that are established for the union and a program that's in place to actually implement those policies. The idea that all workers have rights, international worker solidarity, and to actually address the root problem, which is a temporary foreign worker program that's just the root cause is neoliberalism and all of the attacks that accompany neoliberalism. Precarious work, low wages and benefits, health and safety is jeopardized, certainly workers' rights and unions are jeopardized, and public services definitely are under attack with neoliberalism. This is just an example in terms of the fight back, in terms of that the fight is not an anti-China fight, the fight is not an anti-Chinese worker fight. The idea is that international worker solidarity is the key to address the root causes of neoliberalism and the attacks against neoliberalism. So this is just a case study in terms of the HD mining and what USW did, in a year's time, which might seem long in some cases, but in USW's case, it's quite a quick reaction out of things. So that was just a case study in terms of a very positive outcome to focus on workers' rights and international worker solidarity. Thank you.
Great. And now Michelle from the Wars Issue Campaign and the International Socialists is going to speak about the broader Tory agenda and how we can build a broader fight back.
Thanks so much, Paul. That was really interesting, and I think that speaks to some of the challenges that we face in terms of responding quickly to the kinds of attacks that we're facing, coming obviously for us from the Conservative government and their attacks on refugees and immigrants, but also how important it is to challenge, within our organizations when this type of portrayal is put forward. The fact that at the policy convention this did come forward and it's moved in a positive direction is incredibly important, because I think a lot of times people can get in a situation where they just say, well, to hell with you, you have this racist, clearly a racist or problematic position, and the unions are part of the problem. Instead, to actually say, no, this has to change. We have to fight for this change, and I think this is a really positive outcome. But it speaks to the need for activists to really always be in there making arguments and saying this is not the way to respond to this attack. What I want to do is just maybe situate a little bit. There have been so many attacks on refugees and immigrants by the Conservative government that it's really hard to know where to start. I think the attacks on the interim federal health program that Jesse outlined and the way that the temporary foreign worker program has been used to divide and conquer are two examples. And I think Krishna is going to talk to us also about the experience of the Tamil community and the way that the government has very consciously structured these attacks on various communities in Canada to divide and conquer. I wanted to situate it a little bit in terms of what has informed a lot of what the Conservatives have been doing. We know this is a global issue. Around the world, in response to the economic crisis, the ruling class is everywhere whipping up anti-immigrant sentiment, everywhere. They're using racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia. And as the crisis has hit harder in different countries, they're attempting to deflect attention from the disgusting operations of the 1% and what it has meant, what colossal misery it has inflicted on millions of people around the world, hardship. They're seeking to put the blame for that on workers, on immigrants, on refugees, on communities of color. This has always been a feature of the capitalist system. It's not new, and it's a system that's always ready to deliver those attacks, even as the system in this case needs more immigrant labor and needs those skills from immigrant workers. So it's a really toxic brew that we see in Canada. There's been a ceaseless ramping up of anti-immigrant rhetoric from the Canadian government that's being picked up and amplified in the media. We've seen it, as I said, in relation to Tamil refugees, in relation to Roma refugees from Hungary and from other parts of Eastern Europe, and in relation to refugees from Mexico, to U.S. war resistors who refused to fight in Iraq, and many, many others. Attacks on refugees and immigrants aren't a new feature of Canadian society. As Paul said, Canada is founded on conquest, a colonial settler system, racism. There are so many incidents, whether it's the turning back of Jewish immigrants during the Holocaust or anything you want to think of. And of course, the treatment of First Nations people, which has been so horrific. So it's not a new feature of Canadian society, but I think that it is worth thinking a little bit about the way in which the attacks have accelerated and been particularly, should I say, sneaky is not the word, but the way in which the Conservatives have approached this issue with particular deftness and relentlessness. In 2008, we saw an acceleration of attacks on immigrants, and if you think about it, on October 14th, 2008, a month after Lehman Brothers filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the U.S., and the beginning of that whole crisis that unfolded and that we're still living through, a federal election brought another conservative minority government into power, and the new cabinet included Jason Kenney, now as Minister of Citizenship and Immigration and Multiculturalism. And he replaced Dianne Finley in that role. Kenney had already been very active in the Conservative Party, constructing and implementing a strategy of identifying sections of immigrant communities as a potential source for the 1,000 or 1,200 or 1,500 extra votes they needed in specific ridings to allow the Conservatives to get a majority in government. And so he'd been very busy with that. He had argued with Harper years ago, I read this recently in Maclean's piece about Kenney, that immigrant communities were crucial if the Reform Party at that time and later on the Conservative Party, a continuation of it, were to grow their vote so they could get that majority, because they couldn't ever break past a certain percentage. And so how does a party with a racist, anti-immigration origin make that breakthrough? And the Conservatives' micro-niche constituency approach, engineering support in certain communities, in a process of divide and conquer at the same time. That was at the heart of Kenney's, it was Kenney's contribution really to develop that. So that has been visibly one of the main preoccupations of the Minister of Immigration's office. There was the scandal before the last election over a letter sent from his office to raise $378,000 for ads in the ethnic media. That was part of that strategy to try and dig into immigrant communities. But along with using his position as Minister of Immigration to relentlessly advance that aspect of the Conservatives' plan, he also set out to reshape immigration to focus on the needs of business, to drive down wages while at the same time whipping up anti-refugee sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment to keep people divided, because we know we can't fight unless we build that unity and that solidarity. They even use the language of industrial processes when they talk about how they want to see immigration develop. This is a quote from an interview that Kenney did with the Canadian Press. He said, "Where we want to be in a few years' time is a flexible, just-in-time system of immigration, where we admit people within a year of their application, where people with prearranged job offers are given priority because they succeed the best, where we continue to see a better geographic distribution of newcomers, and where we can more flexibly change the acceptance criteria based on developments in the labor market." So that's pretty explicit market-driven perspective. The temporary foreign worker program was a piece of both the driving down wages, because as Paul showed, 15%, they could be paid 15% less, and at the same time fostering divisions between native foreign workers and immigrant workers. Since 2002, the permanent immigration levels to Canada have stayed at about 140,000 per year, whereas the temporary foreign worker program has tripled. It's estimated over 300,000 temporary foreign workers, oops, sorry, lost my page. Sorry. Already got that. Oh yeah, so it's estimated over 300,000 temporary foreign workers across Canada are in the agricultural, service, food processing, oil, and manufacturing sectors. And according to a piece that Jim Stanford wrote, he's an economist with the Canadian Auto Workers Union, he said temporary foreign workers account for almost 30% of all net new paid jobs created in Canada between 2007 and 2011. This represents the core of labor market strategy by employers, and this obliging government has helped that. And as we know, it's in Alberta and places like that, a lot of these jobs are in just the coffee slinging sector because of low unemployment rates. Low unemployment rates there, they've been bringing in temporary foreign workers for those jobs. All the while, the Conservatives have been cutting family reunification programs, giving business a bigger role in determining who comes into the country. And in the Star, Harun Siddiqui wrote in a column, he said, Kenny wrecked the regular immigrant stream. He tossed out 98,000 applicants, representing 278,000 people, lined up around the world for the federal skill program, a program that had been in existence for a long time. There was a big backlog. He just tossed out those applications. And he says, it's curious for a politician who caters to a constituency that routinely attacks refugee claimants as queue jumpers. Well, they were in the queue. The queue's gone now. That's the way it just shows that what hypocrisy is. And he finishes by saying he has since also placed a moratorium on both investor and entrepreneur visa programs, where individuals who want to set up a business in Canada can come over, and he's reduced the parent and grandparent sponsorship program. So by pitting workers against each other, the temporary foreign workers program controversy had the potential to fuel nationalism and xenophobia. But the erosion of workers' rights through the maximum exploitation of migrant workers is a class issue that transcends national borders. Temporary foreign workers deserve all the rights and protections that Canadian workers have fought for, and the labor movement has to fight to expand those rights to everyone. I think this campaign is one example. The campaign Paul talked about is an example of how to do that, how to frame that debate. And I think it is actually getting traction and showing people that this is the way to counter these attacks by the Conservatives. The Conservative government has engaged in a conscious process of driving up division and cynically fostering this anti-immigrant sentiment. It's not in any way accidental, it's very systematic. But where we are right now, it can sometimes feel like we're swimming in a sea of people who think that refugees are living a good life in Canada, they come here, they have better health care than we do, and all of the things that they've been saying are complete lies. That people are flooding into Canada, that immigrants are taking good Canadian jobs, but the reality is working class people actually don't instinctively run to racist ideas to explain their hardships. It's actually not, unlike the way it's portrayed, that there is this kind of redneck response that's automatic. It's actually not the case. The state and media play a fundamental role in shifting the blame from the 1%, where it rightly belongs, onto immigrants and refugees. And I want to just look at a few of the ways Kenny has sought to do that. 2 minutes. In 2009, Kenny commissioned an extensive survey conducted by Decima through focus groups in 6 regions of the country about attitudes regarding refugees and immigrants. And what the survey found was, first of all, the state of the immigration and refugee system was a second-level concern for participants. The economy and jobs were the top priority for most of the people in this study. In some of the groups, and among some specific individuals, there were concerns raised about false refugee claims, but most did not feel that there was a huge problem with systematic abuse, or that such abuse is worse here than in any other country. I'm reading from the survey here. The conclusion of the survey was, in principle, we found that participants overwhelmingly believed in the idea of Canada being among the most open countries to refugees in the world. The idea that Canada is a humanitarian society that helps people who face persecution or risk physical harm is something about which Canadians feel good, and most wanted the system to err on the side of fairness when dealing with refugees. So that was what the study found. The feeling is similar to the feeling Canadians have about our role as peacekeepers. It is part of Canadian identity. I'm reading here, this is not what I personally think, but this is what they found. That is not to say that none were concerned about the number of refugees and the impact of refugees on the economy, as of taking jobs from other Canadians, but this view was held by a relatively small number of participants. That's what the survey found. Those were the main findings. But this was not meshing with what Kenny wanted to do and where he wanted to take the thing. Kenny was already hard at work before this survey came out in July of 2009, trying to change the channel on this. Beginning in December 2008, Kenny began repeating the phrase, and you'll find this, just look up bogus refugee claim. You'll find it starts then, shortly after he became Minister of Immigration. The Roma are bogus refugee claimants. U.S. war resistors, bogus refugee claimants. People fleeing violence in Mexico, bogus refugee claimants. And he just started talking about queue jumpers in that context. And of course he found a very receptive media saying, you know, finally the abuse in our system is going to be dealt with, et cetera, et cetera. Kenny's line framing this has been actually, it's very interesting, I won't have time to get into it. We need to cut down on abuse, on our generosity, if we don't want to end up with a xenophobic party in Canada. He has said this in interview after interview. It is really the most evil kind of like the way that they want a xenophobic party and they want a xenophobic outcome. I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, that's certainly my view. But it's a sick joke that he says this in the media. If we're not careful, because of popular opinion, people are unhappy about how our system's being abused. We're going to end up with a racist party. But that survey showed you, actually, that's not where most people are at. Most people actually would rather err on the side of fairness for refugees. That is actually where people were at. And whatever that means for people, they weren't, there's a bunch of other things in that survey that says, for example, the vast majority of people surveyed did not want the kind of detention centers that you see in many countries for refugees. They thought it was inhumane and not the way to go. But he started doing this, and the sick thing about it is that there are countries with xenophobic parties, like in Hungary, where the Roma, the Jobbik party, where the Roma have been viciously attacked by these parties. So I guess I have to, I'm trying to think about a cut here, but the main thing I guess I would say is the Conservatives have used xenophobia, and Krishna will talk about the experience of the Tamils. They've also used Islamophobia as a key tool. Harper said the greatest threat to Canada was Islamicism, whatever that may be. Kenny banned the niqab from citizenship ceremonies, and they've also, used immigration to advance their ideological views in other ways. No to war resistors, yes to more private church sponsorships, rewriting the citizenship guide, and instituting the practice of having Afghanistan veterans, Canadian military veterans at each citizenship ceremony. And I think for us, I think we should take hope out of the thing that the survey found, which is that actually there's not this hardened opposition to immigration and to refugees in this country. But we know we have to be vigilant. The question of the Temporary Foreign Workers Program shows that. And I just want to mention the importance of mobilization when people are under attack, like the doctors did around the federal health. It's what happened in England yesterday. Just that in the wake of the murder of the UK soldier a couple of weeks ago, there have been rampages by racists in the English Defence League and the British National Party. They tried to march in London yesterday, a fascist march in London, to whip up anti-Muslim sentiment, and they were met by an overwhelming number of anti-fascists that stopped them from going through the streets of London, completely stopped them. They said, no pasarán, just like in Spain in 37, and they blockaded the roads, and the fascists did not march in London yesterday. That is actually the kind of, ultimately, when these attacks come up, we have to be able to...
Great, so as we've heard, the Tories use racism for very broad attacks on terms of healthcare and wages, but they also have very specific attacks. So Michelle mentioned the attacks on the Roma, the attacks on Muslims, and the attacks on Tamil communities. There's also been a lot of very inspiring resistance from all those communities, and Krishna's played a leading role as director of the National Council of Canadian Tamils. We're very happy to have him here today.
brothers, it's an absolute pleasure. Sorry, I caught my tongue there. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today with you. Just looking around the room, I recognize many faces who I've organized with, both on the panel and amongst the audience, on a variety of different fronts. We've been involved at the forefront for the struggle for students' rights, on the forefront for the struggle for workers' rights. We've been involved at the forefront for the struggle against imperialism and racism. And today, it's an absolute honor to talk about a broad issue that definitely has very specific case examples that we can draw lessons from. And by looking at that specific case example, we can then also understand how, for instance, the struggle against imperialism, the struggle against occupation, the struggle against genocide is interconnected to domestic issues where we may not necessarily always see those types of links and those types of connections. So in order to give you a thorough kind of idea as to why the Conservative Party attacked the Tamil community in the first place, and why did they decide to attack, for instance, boat people who were coming halfway across the world through hell and high water to get here, we have to have a little bit of a historical understanding as to what the Tamil people were coming out of. What was the context that forced them in the first place to get on a boat and come halfway across the world? Now, for the last 60 years, the experience of the Tamil nation, which is in the north and the east of the island of Sri Lanka, has in some ways been very, very similar to the experience of our sisters and brothers in the occupied state of Palestine. Just like our sisters and brothers in Palestine, the Tamil nation has experienced a slow, persistent, but relentless form of genocide that has sought to destroy and dismantle their national existence as a people within their homeland. And this type of genocidal policy against the Tamil nation has sought to destroy the Tamil people's national existence as a unique political entity through both legalized discrimination that denied them access to education, that denied them equal language rights within the post-colonial state, that denied them land rights, for instance, while at the same time using violent persecution in a very explicit campaign of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Now, the Tamil people did resist within their homeland. Of course, they resisted peacefully. There were civil disobedience campaigns. There was parliamentary agitation. But eventually what we saw happen is that the Sri Lankan state outlawed that type of resistance, that type of peaceful parliamentary political agitation. And so it opened up the room. It opened up a vacuum where armed struggle became the predominant form of resistance for a nation that was facing genocide against a state that was acting with complete impunity. I can go into more detail about some of the parallels between some of the genocidal states that we've seen in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, and other South Asian nation states. But I think for the time being, I'll just limit my analysis to what's going on with the Tamil nation. So, for 30 years, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam spearheaded the revolutionary struggle of the Tamil nation against imperialism and against genocide and colonialism. By the early 2000s, there was an experience where the LTT was at the peace talks table along with the Sri Lankan state, and this is where we start to get a little bit suspicious. Lo and behold, the facilitators of those talks were the United States, Norway, the traditional kind of satellite states and voices of imperialism around the world. They proclaimed that they were interested in reaching a peaceful solution for the ongoing conflict in the island, but what they actually did was completely the opposite of that. What they actually did was they started to rearm and to refund the Sri Lankan state. They started to rearm and refund the Sri Lankan military. In fact, they provided military support, they provided economic support, diplomatic cover, and so part of the scheme of this also extended to Canada, because here in Canada there are 300,000 Tamil refugees who went on to form a very vibrant and very strong community right here in Toronto. And all over the world, there are about 1 million Tamil people who went on to form the global Tamil diaspora. But in 2006, due to both United States and UK pressure, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam were banned here in Canada in April 2006 by our federal government. So what this effectively did was it took the national aspirations of a people struggling for legitimate things like self-determination, for legitimate rights like peace and freedom, and moved it from the domain of the political into the domain of the criminal. Now, this is exactly what laid the way and kind of paved the foundation for the type of criminalization that we've seen of Tamil refugees under the austerity measures, under the type of hysteria that both Harper and Kenny have whipped up over the last few years. So in 2010, actually what I should also mention is that the way the war ended itself was completely brutal. By 2009, most of you may have been familiar with the historic protests that were going on in the streets of Toronto and in capital cities all over the world, where Tamils were calling for an end to the bloodshed. And I'm proud to say that many of the people in this room were right there with us during that time. They were on the streets with us. They were at places like the Gardner, for instance, with us. They were standing in solidarity with us, shoulder to shoulder, as sisters and brothers. And we were resisting this genocide. We were resisting this internationally aided and abetted massacre against the Tamil nation. But what happened is that, eventually the war took its course. The rest is history. A UN panel came out talking about war crimes and crimes against humanity. Still, the major establishments of the world refused to recognize that, in fact, what happened was a blatant example of genocide, and that there's only one form of restitution for genocide, which is self-determination, sovereignty. But anyways, all of this that transpired in the island and everything that transpired in Canada has led the way to the criminalization, first of all, of the Tamil liberation struggle, and by virtue of that, Tamil people, anyone who is talking about the Tamil right to self-determination, which again then paves the way for the criminalization of refugees. So in May 2010, we saw the first boat come, the first boat load of Tamil people coming in from the island. There were about 76 refugees at that time on board a boat called the Ocean Lady. And immediately we started to see this type of hysteria being whipped up by the conservative government. We started to hear rhetoric, empty, cheap rhetoric, in fact, about human smugglers and about so-called terrorists. And then a few months later, in August of that same year, we saw the Ocean Lady come off the shores of British Columbia. And again, the same type of empty, cheap rhetoric about human smugglers and about terrorists. But if we actually look into some of the main arguments that were being supported by establishment press, by establishment news TV, and we actually kind of start to break those arguments down, what becomes very clear is that this is simply racism and xenophobia packaged in a very smart and in some ways clever and deceptive propaganda campaign. So the first argument that was made is that there were human smugglers and terrorists on board the ship. Now, I don't need to go into too much more detail about the way in which Tamils have been criminalized by virtue of their legitimate struggle for self-determination, but something that's important here is that the federal government's lawyers tried to invoke something called Section 86 of the Immigration and Refugee Act. And Section 86 actually allows for the presentation of secret evidence that will somehow justify the claim of terrorists and human smugglers. They tried to do this with both votes, and in fact what happened is that the government's own lawyers had to revoke its invocation of Section 86 because there was no evidence of human smugglers and terrorists being on board the ship. But of course the mainstream media is not going to report this, right? So it comes down to subversive voices like ours to talk about what actually happened. Another argument that we've heard from Kenny and his cohorts is that, well, this is a huge expenditure on taxpayers' monies, and that you and I, who are putting money into the tax base, shouldn't be wasting our money on these refugees who are probably human smugglers and terrorists anyways. But the fact of the matter is that most of that tax money was misplaced, either, for instance, maybe at that time going into Mike Duffy's pockets, or perhaps right now going into the incarceration of refugees, women and children who were coming on board these boats. So that money was wasted on a worthless security operation and on incarceration of innocent refugees. Another argument that we've heard, for instance, is that, well, the immigration system is so generous, and because it's so generous, these people are taking advantage, they're exploiting the system. Now, let's look at the actual numbers of what was going on in 2010, in or around the same time as those two boats come in. Deportations have increased by 50%, even before widespread media hysteria about these two boats coming into the country. 13,000 people were already deported in 2010 alone. So the only conclusion that we can make is that these two boats were used as a form of scapegoating. These refugees were used as a form of scapegoating to justify the federal government's regressive, repressive, racist, xenophobic policies against immigrants and refugees. Another argument that we often hear is, well, you know what, they should just take legitimate channels to get here, taking a boat doesn't make any sense. Well, obviously they're facing genocide, they're facing war crimes, they're facing crimes against humanity. Of course it doesn't make sense to take a boat, but what other options option do they have? If they could take a plane, they probably would, right? But obviously this type of logic doesn't factor into the conservative establishment's discourse around immigrants and refugees. And so they have to whip up this type of ridiculous and ludicrous logic that doesn't make any sense to start off with. But the fact of the matter is that the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees actually said that there's no penalty for refugees who by definition are fleeing war crimes, crimes against humanity, persecution, occupation. There's no penalties on them for taking either quote-unquote acceptable modes of transportation or non-conventional modes of transportation. So the conclusion that I want to make here is that these attacks that are happening against refugees in general and the Tamil community specifically is really a way to scapegoat misspent social funding. It's really a way to scapegoat the fact that our federal government has refused to invest into social services like education. It has refused to invest properly into social services like healthcare. Instead, the money has gone into a prison, industrial, military complex. It's gone into corporate tax cuts, and it's gone into, like I mentioned earlier, the pockets of people like Mike Duffy. So we need to actually fight back. We need to actually take a stance that says, hey, look, you can't pin us against each other. As working class people, we're all in this struggle together. And you can't whip up racist sentiments against us to divide us and to make us fight each other. And I think that, sisters and brothers, you and I are already on the same page. So now what we have to do is we have to take this message out to the broader mainstream, and we have to talk to them about these types of issues that are actually a wastage of our tax dollars and actually a denial of the democratic tradition in this country. Thank you so much for your time.